The stages of listening to Boise State Public Radio podcasts. Step 1, testing the waters. You tune into an episode or two. Nothing too serious. Step 2, you got a little hooked on one of those series like Extremely American or Scandalized, and now you're binging. No judgment, but you did listen to it in one day. Step 3, now you're subscribed to a feed. You get notifications to your phone every time there's a new daily episode of The Connector or Idaho Matters. I see where this is going. Step 4, you realize how much time you're spending with Boise State Public Radio podcasts and the fact that it doesn't cost you a dime. Step 5, you decide to step up and support your podcast listening because you can, because you want to, not because you have to. All right, now's the time, you podcast fan you. Go to boisestatepublicradio.org and click donate to support your love of Boise State Public Radio podcast listening today.
More Idaho Matters from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. At one time, the West was covered with millions of bison and were an integral part of the culture of indigenous tribes who lived alongside them. After being hunted almost to extinction back in the 1800s, a large group of people are now coming together to try and return those big animals to Blackfoot lands and into Glacier National Park. We first heard about the ENI Initiative Conservation Project back in March, so we wanted to check back in and find out how things are going. So joining us now are Libby Lundstrom, Professor of Environmental and Global Studies in the School of Public Service, and Matt Williamson, an Assistant Professor of Human Environment Systems, both at Boise State University. I want to welcome you both to the program.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks.
So, Libby, let me begin with you. Can you remind us what the ENI Initiative Conservation Project is?
Yeah, the ENI Initiative is a project to get free-roaming buffalo, or ENI in the Blackfoot language, back on the landscape, to get them first onto the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana, and then they will move freely into Glacier National Park and up into Waterton Lakes National Park in Canada. And these are landscapes that have not seen free-roaming buffalo in over 100 years.
Wow. So, Matt, what is the Indigenous-led ecological restoration team? Like, who makes this up?
The team right now is Libby, myself, our amazing postdoc, Maddie Stevens, and then a group of cultural and tribal leaders from the Blackfoot Nation and the Blackfoot Confederacy more broadly, and a whole army of undergraduate students that sort of help us comb through all of the information we've gathered for the last few years.
So my understanding is that 49 bison were released in 2023 on the Blackfeet Reservation. Libby, what has happened since then?
Yeah, so they were released, and a number of them actually turned around and went back to the thought was that they would move into Glacier, and a number of them turned around and went back to the site where they were released from. And it was interesting for us because we thought, this will be the project not moving forward, that the buffalo are not moving kind of freely as was anticipated. But we did a number of follow-up interviews, and the sentiment was very much the opposite. The sense was the buffalo will do what they want to do, and that's fine. And we're just here to support them, and we'll work on more reintroductions. And from one perspective, the sense is that the project was spectacularly successful because it brought the Blackfeet and the Glacier National Park Administration to the table to work on a project that they both were really passionate about. And that through those dialogues, that really fractured relationship between the park and the Blackfeet, that it's beginning to heal through that process. So even though the buffalo themselves have decided not at this point to move freely, that the project itself is a success for perhaps some non-obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm. Have more bison been released since 2023?
That was in 2024.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
Yeah. So no, I think there's been kind of going back to the drawing table and thinking about a softer release where buffalo are given more time to acclimate and to move around and to just slow down a bit and give them the time that they need. So it's sort of in the replanning stages right now.
But I really like this idea, though, Libby, as you said, right? Just beginning that conversation between these two entities that were so fractured. And your team interviewed tribal elders to find out more about really the significance of the bison to the Blackfoot culture. Can you or Matt or both of you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I mean, it can't be overstated the importance of the buffalo to the Blackfeet culture in terms of not just their food source, but really their identity. And we were kind of brought in to learn about the Blackfeet understand buffalo not as sort of an animal that's separate from them, but really as their like brother or sister, their kin. And so when the buffalo were wiped out, it became this devastating blow to the Blackfoot. They lost their food source. They became dependent on the federal government. And it was really an attack on their culture. And I think this is one of the reminders of why the Buffalo Reintroduction Program is so important, is because it allows Blackfoot culture to be rebuilt and to rebuild those relationships. So not just about getting this majestic creature back on the landscape, but really allowing for some profound healing and cultural revival through that process.
And Matt, how are cattle ranchers responding to having bison back in the ecosystem?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think that it sort of depends on who you ask. I think that in Montana there is a fair amount of antagonism between the cattle industry and anyone working with buffalo, largely at least on the surface due to concerns about disease transmission. But I can say that in a lot of other places in the US where buffalo ranches and cattle ranches exist side by side, they seem to get along relatively well. And so Montana is maybe a little bit of a different case in terms of uh, how strongly negative, at least the political reaction has been to the presence of buffalo. Places like South Dakota and Nebraska have had this sort of coexistence for quite some time and seem to be navigating it fairly well. So I think it's important to separate the opinions of the sort of larger industry from the opinions of those folks who actually share the landscape with these animals.
Well, and my understanding too is that the reintroduction has been called a multifaceted challenge. And I know that your team is trying not to approach this in a silo. So Libby, how important are partnerships to this project moving forward?
I think they're huge. And that's one of the most beautiful things I think about this project is it's brought different people together who historically have not seen eye to eye. And I think Glacier and the Blackfeet are a good example of that. But I think there's also a lot to learn about the ranching community. And one of the things that we heard multiple times from the Blackfeet themselves, Blackfeet ranchers and non-tribal folks, is that when we talk about the reintroduction of buffalo, one of the reasons we're even able to have that conversation is that ranchers have taken such good care of the land, and that ranchers are a really important partner in this as well. While recognizing there's tensions there, but hoping that this can also be a way to get buffalo advocates and ranchers at the same table and having a conversation. So I think it really is. It's important to think about the buffalo really bringing all these diverse people with diverse interests together. And that was sort of, we were reminded of that a lot of times of like, give the buffalo credit for this. They're the ones that have really allowed this conversation to happen.
Yeah. Well, and since the buffalo are doing what the buffalo will do, which is not move into Glacier National Park, right? At least right now. What, as you mentioned, you're kind of reconfiguring things, but what's your hope? What are you hoping is next?
Well, I mean, I think hope for the buffalo is that they do move into Glacier and up into Waterton, and that becomes sort of an expansive habitat for them. I think for us, for our research, one of the things, how we're moving forward, we have new funding from the National Science Foundation to ask more questions on this and to work with tribal partners when we write up our results, that we write with them, that they become our partners in telling the story. This really is the story of the Blackfeet people, and making sure that it's not just us as non-tribal academics telling that story on their behalf, but providing opportunities for doing that collaboratively. Maybe Matt has something to add there too.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the interesting thing about this entire project has been the recognition that for an animal like the buffalo, most of the landscape should be available to them. It's the invisible lines that we draw, whether that's through property ownership or different management agencies. It's those things that tend to serve as barriers. And my hope as this project moves forward and other projects like it that we're starting, that we find ways to actually build the relationships and conversations necessary to help people and those animals ultimately cross those lines.
Well, I appreciate the conversation with both of you. Thank you so much for taking time. We've been speaking with Libby Lundstrom, Professor of Environmental and Global Studies in the School of Public Service, and Matt Williamson, an Assistant Professor of Human Environment Systems at Boise State University. We've been discussing the reintroduction of buffalo to parts of the West. We will, of course, put more information on our website, boisestatepublicradio.org. I'm Gemma Gaudette, and this is Idaho Matters.
We could all use a little help navigating the news these days. The Consider This podcast wants to give you a hand. 6 days a week, we'll help you make sense of the day's biggest news story and what it means for you in less than 15 minutes. Listen now to the Consider This podcast from NPR.